And we're back on Second Street talking about the K-12 system. Big numbers coming from Leger for some polls that we procured at secondstreet.org showing that 55% of Canadians believe the system has gone in the wrong direction over the last 20 years. We're talking with Paige Macpherson from the Fraser Institute about this. Paige, before the break, you were talking about how governments seem to understand that they've got a problem on their hands. I'll just ask you to maybe finish up your thoughts on that, the sort of the evidence that you're seeing.
Sure. So small green shoots, I would say. We have shifted the way in which we've taught kids math. We've shifted the way in which we've taught kids to read. We're seeing now in our test scores that kids are just not doing as well on those really basic core competencies in school. And so you do see some examples of governments like in Ontario. They've said, okay, we're going to reintroduce some of sort of the old ways of teaching math in Nova Scotia, and in other provinces starting to see some movement back towards phonics. So I think, just moving back in a slow, small way towards evidence-based learning and teaching. But I do think this is slow. I think that, there's so much more room to get back to evidence-based, science-based learning in schools. And that's what I assume that parents they see that because they know how they were taught things in schools. They know how kind of simple it was versus how they're seeing their kids learning today and struggling today. So I think it makes sense that the poll numbers reflect this.
Mm-hmm. Well, at least it's encouraging that at least some provincial governments understand they have a problem on their hands. That would seem to be the first step for addressing anything, is admitting you have a problem. I want to ask you about some of the other numbers that we got from our poll. When we asked Canadians about different aspects of the public school system, the areas where they had the most concerns in terms of the top three were accountability and discipline. Very significant concerns there. 63% of Canadians saying wrong direction, only 17% saying right direction. Schools and the priorities that they're setting for in terms of the content that they're teaching to kids. More Canadians believe that that's gone in the wrong direction than the right direction. And then the third largest area of concern involved sex education and gender content related to schools. Let's start with the first one there, just in terms of discipline and accountability. Some of the respondents talked about things like no-fail policies, just shuffling kids along year after year after year without them ever learning sort of the importance of actually being accountable and having to meet the objectives that were set out. Does that surprise you at all that this was the number one concern? And do you have any thoughts around sort of other concerns that parents are raising about discipline and accountability measures in schools?
Yeah, so there's the academic side of the accountability measures, which is things like no-fail policies, things like a movement away from standardized tests, for example. In provincial education systems across Canada, our own research at the Fraser Institute has shown that there has been a decrease in the number of standardized tests and also the quality of those standardized tests, broadly speaking, across the country. That's an accountability failure, really, for individual students, for teachers, and for schools, and for provincial governments. These are really costly initiatives that we're talking about, educating K-12 students. And then, of course, there's the accountability piece when it comes to discipline and behavior. Here in Nova Scotia, where I live, last week there were student walkouts there over violence and behavioral issues in schools that are just not being addressed. If you look at the polling numbers that teachers' unions do in several of the provinces, violence against teachers and staff is a persistent issue that teachers are raising. This is something that, you just didn't see when I was in school, in public school in Ontario growing up, but you really do see as a consistent issue coming up now. And I think parents are recognizing, and teachers as well, that there is just a lack of accountability built into the system. And that's a huge distraction for learning. And also, of course, safety needs to be paramount in these schools.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more. Just, do teachers have enough powers right now to deal with students that are unruly?
I think it's an interesting question. I think there has been this sort of pedagogical shift as we're talking about, we've changed the way that we teach reading, we've changed the way that we teach math. There's been a shift in the way that we teach kids. And the shift has been toward more student-centered learning, which sounds really great on paper, but it's been away from teacher-directed learning. And there has been a broader shift, I think, away from the kind of position as the sage on the stage teacher, leading the classroom. And that speaks, I think, to the discipline and accountability issues in the classroom as well.
Okay. Well, listen, when we come back, I want to ask you about some of the poll numbers that the Fraser Institute released, because I think those are pretty interesting too. We'll be back with more on the K-12 system in just a moment.